Please welcome with me Professor Dr. Abel from Technical University Berlin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gag, for your friendly words of welcome. Before I start with my talk, I would like to take a chance to welcome you in Berlin and at the Technical University of Berlin. And I can do that as a former vice president of the university and on behalf of the actual president, Professor Thomsen at the university. We are very proud, and it's a pleasure for us to be the hosting institution of your World Conference this year. Thank you very much. I want to talk about the subject types of knowledge and their interactions, and new orientation and analysis, therapy and coaching. And I will do that by 3 steps. First, what is at stake? Second, a crucial distinction between different types of knowledge. And third, some examples of interaction between different types of knowledge. That is the main program I want to talk with you. And this is sponsored also by the International Institute of Knowledge Research at the Technical University. And we have a publication series called Berlin Studies in Knowledge Research. So what I'm going to do is just to talk you a little bit about what we are doing and what I am interested in. And I hope, given the close interactions and interpenetrations between psychology, therapeutical, and philosophical questions, I hope there might be some hints of interest for you coming from philosophy. Coming to my first point, what is at stake? As human beings, we live in triangular relations between ourselves, other persons, and the world. Usually, these relations function directly, or to put it more strongly, smoothly, connectively, and self-evidently, unless there are disturbances or problems. This smooth functioning in human experience, communication, action, and cooperation can be analyzed, that's what I want to propose, as an interplay, can also be analyzed as an interplay between different types of knowledge. Between, for example, verbal knowledge, pictorial knowledge, theoretical knowledge, practical knowledge, behavioral knowledge, bodily, explicit, implicit, technical, and aesthetic or ethical knowledge. You know, the first point is, this is my first little thesis, an irreducible plurality of types of knowledge. There is not just one type of knowledge. It's an irreducible plurality, and I would like to focus on this question and look at the interplays and the intersections, and to make that fruitful for the transactional analysis, if I succeed. Later on, I will put special focus on the relation between implicit and explicit knowledge, 2 types of knowledge, and on the importance of this interplay for analysis, therapy, and coaching. But let me first say some words about the overall framework of the approach. In another context, I coined the study of the interaction between different types of knowledge. I coined it as systematic knowledge research. Today, I want to argue for the relevance of these interactions of types of knowledge in the field not only of philosophical epistemology, but also, in first place, in psychological analysis, therapy, coaching, and consulting. When it comes to troubles, problems, or disturbances, or even disorders between such interplays, we may first analyze the disturbances as disturbances between different types of knowledge. And second, describe the problem solving. That's a crucial point for what I want to say. To describe the problem solving as a or new establishing of smoothly functioning interactions of types of knowledge. Normally we function and our relations to other persons in communication and cooperation, this functions smoothly. But there is easily come up with problems and disturbances. And then what is it that we have to do? We try to get back to reformulate, to newly establish a smoothly functioning of interactions of types of knowledge, which is equivalent to smoothly functioning of interaction between persons in their communication, cooperation, and transactions. Here comes my major thesis for today. When conflicting perspectives, troubles, and crises that require solution therapy and coaching arise in our triangular I-we world relations, strange word, it is, I think, a promising strategy to reframe the problems as well as to solve them by relaunching smooth interplays between the different types of knowledge involved. That's the basic thesis I want to argue for. The loss of smooth interactions of different knowledge types and between different persons and cultures, I will say a word later on this, the cultural component. The loss of smooth interactions plays a major role in existential mental interpersonal and transactional crises. Such loss leads to instabilities and, in borderline cases, to a diffusion of personal and social and cultural identity. To put it the other way around, effective personal identity depends, among other things, on a smooth functioning of a network and space of knowledge types. Summarizing the goal of successful analysis, therapy, and coaching in a short slogan, one might say, make experiences, communications, and actions smooth, orientational, and effective. Being in a state of successful interplays and thus of coherence in our experiencing, feeling, perceiving, speaking, acting, and Gestalt building can also be described as being in a state of, and I use an expression from the American philosopher John Rawls, reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium between the different types of knowledge involved. If this equilibrium gets in turbulence, the fragile personal as well as social identity is at risk, and a loss of mental, person, and action-centered stability may be a consequence. Thus, the networks of types of knowledge are involved first in setting boundary conditions, and second, in setting limits for finite human beings, we are finite human beings, and their personal and social identities. The boundary constraints from nature, culture, other persons, the world, mark edges for the shaping of our experiencing, perceiving, speaking, acting, thinking, Gestalt building, and Gestalt preserving. Limits signify the borderlines at which our human actions and attitudes cease being possible. So you realize I make a distinction between boundaries and limits and borders, by the way. Limits like, e.g., our physical, bodily, sensory, and cognitive state and shape, or our capabilities, mark the borderline we cannot go beyond as finite beings. Without boundary conditions, we would not be the beings we are. It's a little bit like a cube without edges would not be a cube. So boundary conditions are very valuable conditions. Borders to go beyond is another subject, but boundaries as the making sense boundaries for our existence and cultural existence is of high importance. Without limits, we risk to diffuse entropically as persons. It is only by acknowledging boundaries and limits that we can become a person. The identity of a person cannot be described as a once-for-all solid and guaranteed entity. It has to be described as a fragile and dynamic equilibrium of ourself inside the triangular relation between I, myself, other persons, and the culture and the world. By the way, there are limits between the different types of knowledge themselves. For instance, there are limits of language in expressing inner feelings and experiences. In addition, the different knowledge types cannot be translated and transformed and transacted into one another, e.g. pictorial knowledge into linguistic knowledge, without indeterminacy of translation and transactions. So it's crucially important, but we have even no rules for this type of translation and transformation and transactional activity. That makes the subject so interesting, I think, for me at least, and so intriguing in going into analysis to do work of research. In the next step, I want to sharpen my tools by distinguishing narrow and broad concepts of knowing. And I prefer talking about knowing to put the accent on the emphasis on the activity side and not speaking of knowledge in a very rigid and fixed sense. So knowing something is different from having a knowledge about something. First, the narrow concept of knowledge pertains to acts of cognition that are bound up with method-governed procedures and with justification, truth, and demonstrability. It's the narrow sense of knowing. Any instance of this sort of knowledge must be communicable, tradable, and intersubjectively verifiable. The sciences are paradigmatically characterized by such a concept of knowledge and knowing. This is the narrow sense. The broad sense, which I found much more interesting than the narrow sense, and which is more relevant for the transactional analysis also, I suppose, and think and hope. The broad sense and the broad concept of knowing signifies, on the one hand, our abilities involved in grasping what is going on and what various things are about. For instance, a gesture, an image, a sentence, and actions. On the other hand, and this is the main constituent of my use of the broad sense of knowing, on the other hand, the broad sense also pertains to the realm of basic human capabilities, competencies, abilities, skills, practices, and proficiencies. So we are full of competencies. We speak language, we have relations to other persons, and we know how to deal with other persons in the normal case. The boundary case and the limit case put a little bit aside. So we have an enormous amount of knowledge inside ourselves that we activate in having relations to other persons, to ourselves, and to the world, and inside our cultures, the different cultures. I will come back to that. In this broad sense of the expression, knowledge is an inviolable component of the facticity of every human experience, action, speech, and thought. It's not just the scientific type of knowledge, that's the narrow type of knowledge. The broad type of knowing I tried to sketch is a much broader sense and a much deeper sense. It is internally linked to our human facticity of our lives. That's the way we live our lives, in activating and realizing and employing these different broad senses of knowledge. And we are, not surprising to hear that, entirely familiar with these structures of the broad sense of knowing, in everyday life, in the arts and sciences. So now I come to my third point, and I have different types of knowledge, and I will give a special focus on the fourth point, explicit and implicit knowledge. But before, let me just give you, to further strengthen a little bit the whole picture, conceptual and non-conceptual knowledge, distributed and integrated knowledge, knowing how and knowing that, explicit and implicit knowledge, that are different types of knowledge, the interplay of which I'm extremely interested in, and I think to spell out some of the mechanisms of these interplays and interpenetrations of these different types of knowledge may help us to make our lives better and to make disturbances and disorders disappear. That's the big motive behind. The first example, conceptual and non-conceptual knowledge. For instance, knowing that the next mailbox is up by the next street section, intersection, is a case of conceptual knowledge. Conceptual knowledge is bound to articulation. It's the narrow sense of the concept of knowledge is focused on scientific knowledge, which is not the only metaphysically serious type of knowledge, as I emphasize here again. But the broader concept is of much more interest than the narrow things. I hope that the president of the university, technical university, will allow these broadening of epistemology and types of knowledge not only to be focused on scientific knowledge. There are different types of knowledge that I mentioned. So this is conceptual knowledge, and the non-conceptual knowledge, I can give you very, very little example and easily some examples. Forms of non-conceptual knowledge include, for instance, experiencing a feeling, knowing how to be jealous, what it is like and how it feels to be jealous, for instance, perceiving, knowing how to open a car door, or knowing what it is like to have a sensation of color, or, as mentioned, to feel jealous. Examples of modes of interplay, big riddles, the interplays, but examples of modes of interplays between these forms of non-conceptual and of conceptual knowledge are easy to adduce. Think, for example, of how a cellist, a musician, a cellist, must combine her non-conceptual knowledge of how to manipulate her instrument, which is a non-conceptual knowledge, it's not a theoretical knowledge. There is no metaphysical call center that we can call up and say, I want to play cello, so please give me the theoretical and the theory about these sentences, how I can manipulate my instrument. It's a question of practice, it's not a theory. And the practice is primordial. Theory can come after things have happened, but the modes of interplay are just a challenge. She has to know, to have a knowing of the ways she manipulates her instrument. That's the non-conceptual knowledge. And at the same time, she has to know the notation and the score of the music piece she's going to play. Let's say the cello piece of Ligeti, for instance, famous music. Second short example, and then I focus on the implicit and explicit, which I think is of very revealing character also for your type of analysis and therapy and coaching and consulting. Let us briefly consider the way in which distributed and integrated types of knowledge interact with and interpenetrate one another in transactional therapy and coaching-centered activities. The following example, I start with a very, very strong example that brought me, by the way, back to to focus on the whole question of these interactions, interplay between different types of knowledge. I think of an operating room in a hospital. I had a conversation many years ago with a neurosurgeon, and the question was, I asked him the question, on what do you rely when performing open brain surgery? So very, very crucial operational thing. Neurosurgeons and he tend to respond that they rely at least at 3 different types of knowing. First, on their eyes and the view on the monitor. That is, on the imaging process and in this sense on pictorial knowledge. They rely second on their practical skill, that is, on their knowing how expressed in their deft and skillful hand movements. It's a practical type of knowing. And they rely third on knowledge gained through their long experience. It's an experiential type of knowledge, which is not the same as that was taught in a faculty of medical surgery in the university. It's done and given by experience, having many experiences in doing operations. And neurosurgeons' activities constitutively rely upon the integrative interplay of different types of knowledge, and each of her actions, that's crucial, each of her actions, of the neurosurgeon's actions, and in particular if it is successful, presupposes this interplay as a matter of course. And what we want to detect and to elucidate in some sense, that's at least my basic idea, is to elucidate this internal presupposition relying on by each of the persons as neurosurgeons in doing their surgery. And you can transmit that example to other areas. Quite analogously, we can describe the following situations as interactions of distributed and integrated types of knowledge, and this focuses more on transactional analysis types. First, I just give 5 to 6 little hints. First, client-centered and action-centered therapy. A very complex stuff, and you have distributed perspectives and integrated perspectives and types of knowledge working successfully together or having problems and disturbances. And then we try to re-establish, to relaunch the smooth functioning of these interactions. Second, think of educational teaching and learning. Third, effectiveness-centered coaching. Fourth, personal relation-focused seminars. Fifth point, environment and e.g., for example, climate change-centered courses. And sixth, group and social institution-centered therapy, coaching, and consulting. So I stop here. Third example, knowing how and knowing that. Under the label of the expression knowing how, we address a variety of abilities, practices, ways of experiencing, procedures, competencies, skills, and proficiencies. We are intimately familiar with the knowing how as a type of knowing across the whole spectrum of our experiences, and I mention from first our everyday practices, e.g., for instance, knowing how to open a door. This seems very simple examples, but going into an analysis, what is already presupposed in exercising the capability of opening a door, that's terrible, and that's a very universe of different components coming into the picture. Second, our acquired skills and abilities, for instance, swimming and behavioral attitudes towards other persons and oneself. To third, higher level activities, for instance, knowing how to follow rules in speech, thought, action, and cooperation. I just may illustrate it by giving and emphasizing the example of speaking, our speech. When we have the competency and the ability to speak our language or foreign languages, this type of knowledge and knowing can be addressed as a knowing how. It's not a semantic knowledge about the semantics of the internal elements of language. So a colleague of mine, Michael David, called this interesting point that speaking a language and understanding oneself, other persons, presupposes a competency, capability, which is not interlinguistic. So the functioning of language depends on the ignorance of language, so to speak, what happens when we fluently and smoothly go into cooperations, into speaking, into communication. I think it's a very interesting point. Or think, for example, if you try to maintain the balance in riding a bike, for instance. This is a very complex thing. It's not a theoretical thing. It's not, as I said, a call up a metaphysical call center and saying, well, I want to ride a bike, and I apparently want to hold my balance on riding a bike. And here, analogously, the relations between persons, other persons, myself, and the world, and are inside the boundaries of cultures. I want to maintain my balance in riding the bike. It's not a metaphysical call center that, please give me the theoretical sentences that I have to learn and the rules that I have to learn to ride a bike and to maintain the balance of my riding a bike. It's knowing how. That's where we use that expression, knowing how, instead of knowing that. It's not a propositional, linguistic, theoretical knowledge. It's not a theory, it's a practice. And that's much harder to analyze and to go into therapy, to knowing how procedures, which are the majority of our actual ways of speaking, acting, interacting, and communication and cooperating. It's much harder to go into that knowing how stuff and to give sufficient and satisfactory analysis, therapy, coaching, and consulting. But I'm deeply concerned and deeply convinced that having success in therapeutical activities and in communicational and cooperational activities, it's crucial to go into that business and to spell that business out, and to, in the hope and that we can find some revealing aspects to make life possible, easier, and to make disappear disturbances and disorders. Not completely, there's no guarantee that we succeed, but the ethical and the humanity impact is on that direction, in my view. So now I stop here to explicit and implicit knowledge, and I become a little bit more specific about that. In the same light that I will emphasize the thesis that focusing the implicit knowledge, I will just tell you what I understand by implicit knowledge instead of explicit knowledge. Focusing the implicit knowledge is, I think, a crucial business for each type of analysis, therapeutical and philosophical epistemology. It's at the interface between philosophy and psychology. Knowledge always contains, I start with this point, knowledge always contains more than just what one explicitly knows. This is the broad sense of knowing I sketched. And we know more than we can say. Knowing contains and involves, and I give you some examples, some keywords in that context. Knowing contains, in that broad sense, abilities, competencies, contexts, background conditions, attitudes, goals, purposes, networks of belief, internalized conventions, habitualized patterns, and implicitly presupposed assumptions of somatic, neural, and physical processes, for instance, the activities of our central nervous system. So you realize what a complex and rich and opulent realm we are entering in when we go into knowing in the broad sense and in the implicit type of knowledge. And if we successfully could enter in that area and do something, and I will talk a little bit about that from now on, then we might reformulate, reframe therapeutical success in having successful interventions in these implicit structures, and to bring about changes in these implicit structures. That is much more important than trying to get changes in explicit knowledge. Intellectual explicit knowledge, I can rationally argue for different changes, but this will not have a guarantee for making disorders disappear or disturbulences disappear. But going into that implicit knowledge realm and bringing about changes in that area, that apparently has a crucial impact for what we might even call, and I use that word in little quotation signs, for healing and for making disturbances disappear. Now, just to give a very simple and very famous example of implicit knowledge, which was given by Michael Polanyi, a philosopher in Chicago many years ago. He gives a well-known example of explicit knowledge. I am hammering a nail into a wall. Hammering a nail into a wall. My conscious attention is focused wholly on the nail and the hammer, hopefully. Otherwise, you have to go to the hospital if you are focused on too many little points. That can give you a very, very delicate situation. But there are many other components than the focusing on the hammer, the nail, and the wall. Many other components in play of which I am not explicitly aware, by which are essential to my, but which are essential to my successfully hammering the nail into the wall. Think, for example, the motion of my hand, the placement of my fingers, the pressure of my grip on the hammer's handle, and many other things. Thus, and that's the crucial point, much implicit, respectively unthematized knowledge must already be in play in order for me to so much as act or gain any orientation. There are further examples closer related to your business, the World Conference of Transactional Analysis, than hammering a nail into the wall. It's just an example to explain a little bit the figure. There are further examples of implicit knowledge, and I give 5 to 6 little ones very close to transactional analysis and therapeutical coaching. First, we are in smoothly functioning relations to other persons, which is not simply a business of explicit knowledge. Not at all. Second, we act inside the context of social institutions, which is not just the business of explicit knowledge and legal text knowledge. Third, we rely on background conditions of successful acting. Fourth, we are involved in educational or in therapeutical processes, for instance, in successful learning situation. If you focus on the relation between a teacher and a pupil, and you as a teacher say, you have to learn that, this is the explicit sentence you have to repeat and to internalize, the success is not very strong. It's much more helpful to get successful educational and therapeutical situations by integrating the different areas of implicit knowledge always already presupposed. If an explicit sentence is accepted by a pupil and the pupil can say, now I can continue the mathematical, arithmetical row for myself. So if she has learned something. So learning, educational, therapeutical activity is a very good and very deep example for implicit knowing, implicit ways of knowing, which we want, I repeat that, extrapolate or to bring about and making clear in our type of analysis and therapy. Further, I mentioned another thing that is always when I talk to the engineers here in my university, a very interesting point. They construe machines and these machines function, for instance, aeroplanes. But the surprising and amazing point is, if you ask, is that only a business of explicit knowledge? They will say, no, there are so much other components involved, so there is a universe of implicit ways of knowledge involved if the machine functions the way it functions. That might be a little bit surprising, but it's an amazing and intriguing example. So, or think, for instance, we know how to behave in a big city, in Berlin, for instance, or in other types of environment. Being able to be oriented in an environment presupposes an enormous amount of implicit types of knowledge. And if we restrict ourselves in orienting in Berlin, for instance, as a city, and you are in that situation to enjoy Berlin, as I heard in the introduction this morning, if you do that only by explicit sentences and explicit knowledge, you are lost in Berlin, and you will never enjoy it. So if, without presupposing the whole amount of implicit knowledge, you would not succeed in orientation and in orienting yourselves, other persons in a city like Berlin, or any other place of environmental inequality. It is important to me, and I want to emphasize that, that's a very deep discussion point in philosophy. That it's important to me here that the relation of implicit to explicit knowledge, the relation between implicit, explicit, and explicit, implicit knowledge, is not a linear and not a one-to-one relation. Sometimes philosophers do that. A colleague of mine from Pittsburgh University, Bob Brandon, for instance, under the slogan of making it explicit, has the basic idea that the implicit encapsulates already everything that later on is focused on discursive analysis and made public. I am not convinced by that thesis, not at all, because I think when the implicit realm becomes explicit, as far as that is possible, there is always something added to implicit knowledge. This transition from implicit to explicit knowledge and transaction involve increased, for instance, increased attention and cognitive determinacy coupled with consciousness. Also an experience I'm sure you have in your work as transactional analysis. You are very familiar with this type of relations between the implicit and the explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is like, I would like to emphasize it that way, explicit knowledge is like a small island in a much broader and deeper ocean of implicit knowledge, which of course is different from ignorance. Hence, success in psychotherapeutical practices and coaching does not only depend on explicit linguistic theoretical knowledge, it depends even more on changes, that is, on problem solving and on making disturbances disappear by means of rearrangements inside the broader space of implicit knowledge. Grasping implicit knowledge is a goal and a resource for problem solving, therapy, coaching, and consulting. However, these opportunities rarely come into view. One of the main reasons is a high risk of falling victim to the centipede syndrome you all know, I'm sure. In other words, automatic skills may be lost as soon as we examine them too closely. I call that paralysis through analysis. Paralysis through analysis. That's the difficulty to handle, the challenge. Tennis or snooker players know this phenomenon well. Their performance often declines sharply as soon as they try to become conscious of normally intuitive moves. Nevertheless, the player's creative improvements and the improvements in the cooperation and communicative structure between myself and other persons and vice versa, the players' creative improvements in their game chiefly depend on making changes in the implicit dimension. Changes in emphasis and orientation within the implicit area are especially important for the generation of problem solving and creative novelty. So I would like to emphasize it lie dormant in the network of implicit knowledge. And what we try in analysis and therapy is to make them coming awakened. So, okay, explications of the implicit knowledge become more difficult as we get closer to the dimension of pre-intentional, pre-reflexive, pre-theoretical, pre-linguistic, and sub-semantic assumptions, processes, and attitudes. Suppose, let us assume we want, and now I come to the end of my talk, let us assume we would like to promote and strengthen a culture of interpersonal trust, interpersonal and intercultural trust. I emphasize these two components, which nowadays should be one of the greatest values of humanity. In order to get this idea underway, to establish, to promote interpersonal and intercultural trust, it is not enough to derive theoretical insights from implicit knowledge or extrapolate practical instrumental behavior. Instead, we need to reveal, and now it becomes very difficult, we need to reveal the unquestioning and usually smoothly functional level on which we deal with ourselves, other persons, other cultures, and the world. We have to make this level productive by means of change. This example also shows the cardinal importance of implicit knowledge for the dialogue not only between individual persons, but also between different cultures. Including implicit knowledge as prerequisite, that is my thesis, in order to understand accordances as well as differences between cultures and persons. To conduct the dialogue, with emphasis on dialogue, means, among other things, to embody the different components of implicit knowledge that make the true vital nerve of an individual person as well as of a culture. Much of what we initially fail to understand about another person as well as about another culture, much is due to the fact that we have not yet gained access to the wider setting of the individual's culture's implicit forms of knowledge. Making progress in this area is obviously a crucial challenge of our times and our generation, and it fits, I hope, a little bit in the overall topic of your World Conference for Transactional Analysis. I quote, and it has been quoted very often this morning, boundaries, a place to meet, to develop, to define identity, and I think focusing on implicit knowledge is a very crucial operation, and I thank you very much for your attention.